Okay, so off camera what I've actually gone ahead and done is actually just created another child of that item data secondary base, and this one's specifically for the ammo stats, so nothing too fancy here, although I guess I do need to probably clear these. No I don't. You can remove the sequence though. But yeah, this is pretty much the same sort of thing. The only difference is we're casting to the item ammo base class, and then we're using the relevant functions to get and update the data. So I've just changed the title. I did update the width a little bit. So if we check that out now, so we pick up a weapons, and then pick up some ammo as well. Let's grab a few items. Now it will kind of display the correct item. So if there isn't one specified, then it just gets rid of it. But if there is one, it will show it. So at the moment there isn't any spotted ammo for the pistol, but for the vector weapon, it does show those ammo as well. Yeah, so that's all handled through that particular widget, and it's just the case of defining it on the item base. But yeah, so I think at this particular point, the next thing I'm probably going to work on is actually the production screen. So as a quick reminder, get to that. That itself looks like this. So again, this is it's not really split up into individual widgets or anything like that. So again, kind of going to be going through and looking for repeatable sort of elements and creating specific widgets for it. So this is sort of on the sort of crafting side of things, I guess. So yes, that's the next thing I'm going to start working on. Again, a lot of what I'll be doing is kind of what I've already gone over. So I'll kind of come back with a little update and give you a bit of an overview once that's been done. Okay, so I'm back. So I have made a little bit of progress in terms of recreating the production menu. So before I give a quick rundown of how I've set that up, let me quickly demonstrate what's currently set up. So now when you click on the production button in the menu, it opens up this section here. So we have some buttons here. It allows you just to filter through the recipes. And then if you click on one of them, such as the sniper one, it then pops up showing the variants that you can create using, the variants that you can make of the sniper. And that's kind of set up with some of the other ones. No images for some of them yet though. But you kind of see how that's sort of working there. So for the most part, this sort of section is sort of working. We do, however, need to make another section here, which I think I will sort of go through on camera and see if we can get that sorted out today. Now, if we go ahead and jump into the production menu widget, so this is what's actually been added to the inventory menu. So I'll quickly show that as well. So we have the widget switcher, so we have the main inventory one, and then we have the production manager listed in there as well. So when you click on production, it just switches the widget switcher. Yeah, so then if we jump into the production menu, the actual widget, and we kind of see a bit of a breakdown of how that's functioning. So I actually use the data display base widget. So as a quick reminder, that kind of has a widget at the top here, which is the text display. So that's what allows us to have essentially a uniform, well, no, not uniform, a consistent sort of style across the widgets. We have the body one, which essentially has a title section, and then you can choose something to go in the body. So I use that one quite a few places here. So we have the main one that goes around the edge for the top, and we then have a vertical box inside of that. And in there we then have a horizontal box for the main sort of section here, and then we have another box at the bottom here, which will be for the crafting queue when I get to that point. If we go to the horizontal box section here, we then have a section for the category buttons. So these are added dynamically, so similar to how the category buttons are handled on the main inventory screen. We then have a central section here, which is another one of the data display base widgets. So that just allows us to have this title at the top here and having it look consistent. In there, I then have another widget switcher. And then inside this one, we have two widgets. We have a craftables display. So that's another widget that handles sort of collecting all the various crafting recipes, well, the recipes that we can craft, and then adding a little icon for them. And then we have then a recipe selector. So the recipe selector widget is what we can use to sort of show the sort of variants for a given item that you can then craft, that you can choose from. So the next widget we'll sort of dive into a little bit. Actually, yeah, let me actually just show some of the logic we have set up in the main production menu. So we have a little bit here on the pre-constructs. This kind of just handles setting up those category buttons for selecting different recipes. So that's these side buttons here, these here. So as part of that, we do bind it to the button press event. So that's this one here. And as a part of this, we then assign the relevant filter to the craftables display. Now this itself I may end up actually changing. I'm not fully sold on it just yet. But moving on, first thing we do on construct is actually just get the crafting manager from the player character, so the character that owns the widget. And this just allows us to just update that and then update the craftables list. The next thing we kind of do is we have some event dispatchers are actually on the craftables display. Sorry, not on the craftables display, on the recipe selector. So this is back and on recipe selected. So we kind of do some things on here accordingly. If we press the back button, we just change back to the index of 0 on the widget switcher. If we actually click on an option like a recipe set as it were, we check to see if the recipes are, the length is greater than 1. If it is, then we update the recipe selector to show those recipes, and then we switch to the relevant index to actually show them. Now I do plan to potentially have something different happen if there's only one recipe in there. I'm not quite sure how that's going to be handled yet, but I'm sure we'll get to it shortly. Now if you open up the actual craftables display, so this is what would control the icons that get displayed. For this we have it in so an overlay and then a scroll box and then a wrap box. So the only reason we have an overlay here is just so it allows us to add a little bit of padding in the top of the bottom of this particular widget. So there's nothing overly complicated there. What we do then do is we have a few functions in here that we can take a look at. So one of the main ones here is the update craftable list. So this is where we just clear that wrap box, check to make sure the crafting manager is valid, and then we get the available recipe sets. And then once we've done that, we come into the load recipe sets. So because these are all soft references, we do have to load them before we can kind of pull any data from them. So for this, I just add it into an array, check to see if it's empty. If it's not, we then get the first element from the array and then we do an async load. Once it's loaded, we then remove it from the array there, and then at that particular point, we can kind of handle what we want to do. So the first thing we do is we actually handle the recipe set. So I'll come to that in a second. What we then do, the following tick, we then check to see if there's anything else left loaded. So we just call the same load recipe sets again, so this one, but we just pass in the same array. So essentially we end up setting it to itself. It would be nice not to have to do that, but it's a nice way to do that. Now, if we come up to the handle recipe sets, up here we check to see whether or not the category for that particular set matches the filter. If it does, then we create a crafting set slot. So you can think of that's kind of the button, and then we call some additional functions here to update it so it looks how it should. And then we bind to the onset selected function on that particular widget. So if we then to go into that particular function and kind of see how that's looking. So there's a little bit more going off on this. So it's very similar to the source that we had. So if we quickly look at that. So if we look at these widgets, they are very similar. There's not major differences in terms of the layout, but I did make a few small tweaks. So the main thing we have here, we have the main button that the player will sort of hover and click on. We then have the thumbnail, which is kind of like the actual image that we're looking for. So that's kind of like the icon, as it were. We have like a hover icon. So that's these little arrows. So when you're hovering over it, it'll show it, and there is a little animation that sort of plays as well. I'll quickly show that. So yeah, nothing overly fancy. And then we have a little name at the bottom. So in terms of what happens with this, we do have the set recipe function. So in here we just store a reference to that particular recipe set. We pull the icon from it and we use that to set the thumbnail. Now I am using the common lazy image. Now the common lazy image is quite nice because you can just pass in a soft reference to a texture, and it will just automatically sort of load it in the background, and once it's displayed it updates the image for you. And then lastly we just sort of update the text as well. Now we do have a few functions in the event graph as well. So one of those is on the destruct. We just unbind anything that's bound to the set selected. That's just so it doesn't cause any issues being called when it's not actually on the screen. Then we have a few things for the hover states, and then lastly we have one for the release, so when the button's actually pressed. So in this example we actually have the event dispatcher that we call. So this just allows this craftables display. So as a reminder, we do bind to every single one that we create to the same function, which is the recipe set selected function, which I will quickly get to in a second. But before that, there is the set hover state. So the set hover state just updates the visibility of the hover and then plays or stops the animation depending on the state that's selected. Again, nothing overly complex there. Now if we come back into the recipe set selected function, this is more like a, what's the word? Almost like a relay function in a sense. So this craftables display has its own event dispatcher, which is also on set selected. And this is actually for the production menu to know about, and that's what this long function is here that I mentioned earlier. And the reason why is so that when we click on something that's inside of the craftables display, in here we can know that that's happened, and then we can switch to the recipe selector if we need to. So that's kind of what that does here. Now the next thing to sort of look at is the actual recipe selector itself. So let me open that up. Now for this one, again we have a vertical box with a common list view. So that just allows us to add entry widgets in a list. And then we just have another instance, that menu button at the bottom here that we can use to go back. Now if we actually look at the functions on here, again there's not that many. But if we start with update recipe selector, the first thing we do again is just get a copy of the crafting manager, so we get that from the owning player. We clear any list items that are currently in the list view, and then we cycle through all the recipes, and we essentially create what we call a recipe entry data. Now the recipe entry data is what will actually be passed to the list view to use to control what it should look like essentially. So there's a few sort of things we pass into there. So whether or not it's locked, as in a recipe is locked, the image that should be displayed, and then the overall recipe class that it sort of, well, object in this case that it sort of refers to. Once we've created the recipe entry data object, we can then pass that to the recipe list, which will then display it. Lastly, what we then do is just scroll back to the top of the recipe list. And the reason we do that is because if we we have a recipe list and we scroll all the way to the bottom, and then we click back and we go back onto another recipe list, like a different one, the scroll box will sort of stay where it was. So we use the scroll to top to force it to go back to the top. Now if we actually just look at the recipe list for a second, We do have the entry widget class that is set up down at the bottom here, and that's just the recipe entry widget, which I'll go over in a second as well. Now, in terms of the last three functions that we have in here, these are just on the main event graph. So again, this is one for clearing all the list items, and then for clearing the selection. This just helps prevent sort of lingering effects from previous selections when this particular recipe selector is removed from the screen. We then have some buttons here, well, button events. So the first one here is for the back. So we just call the on-back event dispatcher that we have here. And that kind of allows us to communicate back with the production menu. And that one calls this function here. After that is called, we just clear the selection on the recipe list. And then we delay until next tick, and then we just call the is selected. We set the is selected state on the menu button. And again, the reason why is because the menu button itself will automatically select itself when it's clicked. And when we switch back to, well, when we show another recipe selector, the back button would show as selected, which we don't want. But because it calls this event dispatcher first, and then after that it updates its state, we do need that delay tick there, so it essentially selects its state after it's updated its state. The last thing on this particular section here is the on item selection changed. Now that itself is actually a part of the recipe list, so there's quite a few options here, and it's the item selection change there. So it's a function that's on there that allows you to denote, well, to get an input or an event for when the player clicks on one of the entry widgets that are added to the list. So for that, we sort of get the item, and we then cast the data entry, and then we can call the on recipe selected. So this on recipe selected again is something we'll be able to access from here. So it's not currently implemented, but that's kind of the bit that I kind of plan to go over shortly. Okay, so at this particular point, this particular recipe selector is, that's all there is to it really. Now the last thing to actually go over is the entry widget itself that's used in here. So let me quickly locate that one. So this is the entry widget. So so there's quite a few things in here. So we have a border which we use for the outline. We have some overlays. We then have a horizontal box, some selected text that goes at the bottom, and then the locked container icon underneath. So if I just toggle that, you kind of see what happens. Now if we go into the main horizontal box, we then have another overlay, then a scale box with some more text. Now the text itself is only actually used if there isn't an icon, and that's just so we can just display the name. It's mainly for debug purposes. But inside the scale box, we then do have a common lazy image. And this is what displays the actual icon. So now again, because it is an entry widget, well, it's tended to be used with an entry widget, we do have to make sure that it implements the user object list entry interface. So we can implement some of those interface functions on here. Now the sort of main one that we kind of implement first is when the item object is set. And from there we can then take the list item object and we can cast to that recipe entry data. We just store a ref to it, so that's kind of the data that this particular entry widget should be pulling its data from. And from there we kind of just check some of the data. So the image, is it a valid soft reference? If it's not, then it comes down here and does essentially display some debug text, just so we know what it should be. If it is valid, then we just set the brush on the lazy image, and then we actually hide the debug text as well. So a few additional things just in terms of the text section here. So again, we choose whether or not we want to show the text based on if the option is locked or not. And we kind of just force the size of the brush. So normally if there's an image set, it would just match what the image size is, and then sort of scale it so it fits within the space. But if it's just the text, I kind of just force it, so they're all roughly the same size. Once it's done that, we then do actually update the image color. So if the particular recipe is actually locked, we apply it with a low alpha and darken it slightly to a grey. And then we have the is locked section here again, which we use to control whether or not we show that the actual locked container. The last thing we do on here is just update the outline, and that's just to make sure that whenever this is updated, it does set the outline to not selected, essentially. Now, whenever a particular entry widget is removed from the list for whatever reason, whether it's sort of when you're scrolling, for example, it sort of gets re-added to the pool, it does call the on entry released, so we just set the image back to null at this particular point. That's just so it doesn't linger when we don't want it to, particularly if the widget gets reused and there isn't actually a valid image on the newly assigned data. What we then have is the on item selection changed. So if you remember in here, I talked about this particular button here, this option. So this is kind of like a blanket one for everything on the actual recipe list itself, whereas this one is specific to the entry widget. So if you actually select the entry widget, it gets updated here. So we can sort of control what happens here. So assuming the recipe isn't locked, we can then update some text visibility. So that's the one to say that it's selected. And then we just update the outline as well. Now this is how the logic for the outline works. So we get a copy of the current outline settings and we store it. We then update the outline settings. In this case, the color. And then we get a copy of the original brush. We update just the outline settings with the new ones, and then we apply that slate brush back to the border. A little bit convoluted, but unfortunately that's kind of how we have to do it. And then lastly, we have the mouse over and mouse leave sort of events. So again, if it's not locked, we then do this. So in this case, we have the render scale. So normally I try to avoid using the render scale, but in this case, just because it is visual only, we actually start with the size of the main widget, so in this case the overlay. It's kind of like the main section. We actually start with that being slightly smaller, so 0.95, and then when we mouse over, we set it back up to 1, and we adjust the colour so it's full opacity again, and it's of a white colour. And if it's not, well, when we leave, we set it back to that 0.95, and then we lower the colour on there slightly, just so it's a little bit darker. So like 0.8 there on the darkness value, or brightness. So as a quick recap, let me show you what that sort of all boils down to. So again, obviously we can filter through the options, and we click on one, so let's show the options in here. So if you look at the overlay, you can hopefully see that the image brightens up a little bit. We hover over it, and it kind of pops out when you're hovering. And then when you click on one that's not locked, it then shows the outline with the selected message. Okay, so yeah, so back to the mission for today. So there is this section here on the right hand side that we need to update. And what that should sort of look like is a little bit like this. So it should give a bit more of an overview of the particular option that we've selected. So in terms of the original section here, it sort of shows how many you've got in the inventory, how many you can craft with your current, based on the ingredients you already have, and then actually a list of all the ingredients to craft that given item. Generally this section here would just be sort of confirming whether or not it's craftable. Generally, because the locked items are already locked before the screen, we shouldn't need that on here. So what we kind of need to do is go through and just kind of update or recreate this particular widget, see if we can tidy up a little bit, and hopefully remove some of the other things. But yeah, and just in case you are interested, the reason why we do kind of need to recreate it a little bit is because previously, with the older system, a lot of the data was kind of pre-set up inside the actual widget itself, which isn't great for scalability. So if you ever want to add a new item with different options, this particular widget just wouldn't hold up very well. So hopefully with the newer system, we should be able to handle that a little bit better.